My brother's voice on the phone was ice. Just get home. Mom needs to talk to you. I thought someone was sick, my heart pounding with fear. But I arrived to see my life in trash bags. This wasn't a family emergency, it was an execution. My name is Joan Harrison, and I never thought the reward for landing the biggest deal of my career would be finding my entire life packed into hefty bags. The scene was something out of a twisted Southern Gothic novel. Our family's ancestral home in Charleston, a grand white-pillared mansion framed by ancient oaks dripping with Spanish moss, had always been a symbol of heritage and stability. But that Friday afternoon, its pristine lawn was desecrated. Dozens of black plastic bags, bulging with my clothes, my books, my entire existence, were lined up along the cobblestone driveway. They gleamed under the oppressive South Carolina sun like grotesque monuments to a life that had just been abruptly canceled. My mother, Helen, stood on the porch, arms crossed, the very picture of cold, aristocratic resolve. Flanking her were my older brother, Richard, and my sister, Gloria, their faces carbon copies of her disappointment. The triumphant smile I'd worn since leaving the Atlanta airport evaporated into the humid air. "What's going on?" I asked, my voice barely a whisper. "What are all these bags?" My mother's gaze cut through me. "Your things," she said, her voice devoid of any warmth. "I suggest you call an Uber. You're 26, Joan. It's time you stopped being a burden." The worst part wasn't the bags, or the heat sticking my silk blouse to my skin. It was the look in my own mother's eyes. A complete stranger. If you've ever looked at a loved one and felt like you were seeing a stranger for the first time, do me a favor and just type the state you're watching from in the comments. I want to see how far this feeling of sudden isolation reaches. A burden. That word echoed in the thick, humid air, heavier than the scent of magnolias and decay. For 3 years since graduating college, I had paid my mother rent, contributed to groceries, and acted as her on-call IT support, all while working 60-hour weeks to build a career she refused to understand. A burden was the last thing I thought I was. As I stood there on that manicured Charleston sidewalk, watching my mother turn her back on me, a cold, hard clarity began to cut through the shock. This wasn't just an eviction, it was a verdict. In their eyes, I had already been tried and found wanting. But this isn't just a story about heartbreak. This is one of those classic family revenge stories, and trust me, the revenge is not what you might expect. It's not about screaming matches or petty sabotage. It's about dismantling an empire of expectations, brick by painful brick, and building something new and unbreakable in its place. They thought they were throwing away their trash, their disappointing, off-brand daughter who chose tech startups over debutante balls. They had no idea they were planting a seed. They saw my ambition as a flaw, my independence as an insult. Let me know if you get this. Were you ever the family's designated scapegoat, or were you the golden child? Type scapegoat if you were always the one explaining yourself, or golden if you never had to. I'm genuinely curious about the balance in the families watching. So, to understand why they did it, you have to understand the world I came from. To understand their cruelty, you have to understand the world I was raised in. The Harrison family didn't just live in Charleston, we were part of its old world foundation. My father, Arthur Harrison, was a legendary investor who had modernized an old family fortune into a contemporary empire. But he passed away from a sudden heart attack when I was in high school, leaving my mother, Helen, as the regent of our kingdom. She ruled with an iron fist clad in a velvet glove, and her only currency was the approval of high society. Our assets were substantial: a $15 million historic mansion, listed on the National Register of Historic Places, and a $50 million family trust that my mother controlled with absolute authority. In that world, there was a preordained path. My older brother, Richard, became a celebrated heart surgeon whose patient list read like a Met Gala guest list. My sister, Gloria, was a razor-sharp lawyer at a prestigious firm handling billion-dollar mergers. They were the golden children, the jewels in my mother's crown. And then there was me, Joan. I didn't want medicine or law. I was fascinated by the digital world, by the way a smart marketing campaign could shift culture. To my mother, that was like saying I wanted to join the circus. She saw it as a common trade, unworthy of the Harrison name. I was the family's black sheep, the quiet disappointment at every cocktail party and charity fundraiser. Despite the constant disapproval, a stubborn part of me still craved my mother's validation. I thought if I could just achieve something monumental, something undeniable in a language she understood, money and prestige, I could finally earn my place. That opportunity arrived disguised as a high-stakes business trip to Atlanta. My firm was pitching to a tech giant, a deal that would be worth millions and put our company on the map. I was chosen to lead the presentation. For 3 weeks, I barely slept, fueled by coffee and the desperate hope that this was my shot. I walked into that boardroom in Atlanta feeling the weight of my family's doubt on my shoulders. I walked out with a signed 8-figure contract and stunned applause from their executive team. My boss called me a rock star. On the flight home, soaring at 30,000 feet, I felt like I was on top of the world. For the first time, I wasn't just the Harrison family's artsy disappointment. I was Joan Harrison, a force in my own right. In my carry-on were carefully chosen peace offerings, a vintage silk scarf for my mother from a boutique in Buckhead, a bottle of rare small-batch bourbon for Richard, and a signed first-edition legal biography for Gloria. It was pathetic, really, how much I fantasized about that homecoming. I pictured my mother's carefully constructed mask of indifference finally cracking into a genuine smile of pride. I imagined her, for once, bragging about me at her next bridge club meeting. I was so naive. I actually thought success would be my passport back into my own family. If you've ever found yourself trying to earn the love that should have been unconditional, just hit that like button for every single one of us who has ever tried too hard. It's a silent little signal that you get it, that you've been there too. The fantasy of my triumphant return lasted exactly as long as the flight. The moment the plane's wheels touched the tarmac in Charleston, a strange silence began to build. I sent a cheerful text to our family group chat. Landed safely. Can't wait to share my incredible news tonight. The message was marked as read by all 4 of them almost instantly. But there were no replies. No welcome home, no thumbs up emoji. Just a cold, digital void. I tried to brush it off. Mom was probably busy with her garden club. Richard was likely in surgery. There were 1,000 rational explanations, but a knot of unease began to tighten in my stomach. Halfway home, my phone rang. It was Richard. He never called me directly. He was a man who communicated through concise, often condescending, group texts. My heart leaped for a second, thinking he was calling to congratulate me. "Hey, Rich," I answered, my voice still bright. His tone was flat, clinical, the same one he probably used to deliver bad news to patients. "Where are you?" he asked. No preamble. In a cab from the airport, about 20 minutes out. "Why? Is everything okay?" A pause stretched, thick with unspoken things. "Mom needs to talk to you," he said finally. "We all do. Just get home." The line went dead before I could ask another question. The warmth of my success vanished, replaced by a chilling dread. I tried calling Gloria, then David. Both calls went straight to voicemail. My mind raced through a Rolodex of catastrophes, an accident, an illness, but none of them fit the icy, deliberate nature of that silence. It wasn't the sound of panic. It was the sound of a plan. The cab pulled onto our street, the grand old homes of Charleston's south of Broad neighborhood standing as silent witnesses. And then I saw it. The scene that Richard's chilling phone call had been a prelude to. The black garbage bags. My mother and siblings standing like a tribunal. I stepped out of the cab, the driver pulling away and leaving me utterly exposed on the sidewalk where I'd learned to ride a bike. The carefully constructed world I knew tilted on its axis. "What is this? Really?" I demanded, my voice shaking with a mixture of rage and disbelief. Gloria, ever the pragmatic lawyer, was the one to deliver the killing blow. "The family estate is being sold," she stated, checking her watch as if my entire life being upended was a minor inconvenience on her schedule. "A developer made an offer we simply couldn't refuse. Your continued presence here was becoming a legal complication." "Sold?" The word didn't even register at first. That house was our history. It had been in the Harrison family for over a century. "You can't," I stammered, looking at my mother for some sign of reason. "Dad's will. He left the house to all of us." Helen let out a short, dismissive laugh. Your father's sentimentality is precisely why he left me in charge of the family trust. The house is an asset, Joan. An asset we are liquidating for $15 million. You will receive a small portion, of course, adjusted to compensate for your years of freeloading. The cruelty was breathtaking. This wasn't just about me needing to grow up. This was a calculated business transaction. They weren't just kicking me out. They were erasing me from the legacy my father had intended for all of us, all for a payday. I didn't argue. I didn't scream. A terrifying, cold calm washed over me. I numbly loaded as many of the garbage bags as I could fit into my old hatchback, the gifts for my family still sitting pristine on the passenger seat, a cruel joke. The last thing I saw in my rearview mirror was the heavy, ornate front door of my childhood home closing, sealing me out forever. I just drove. For an hour, I circled the historic streets of Charleston, the charming antebellum architecture feeling like a mockery of the ugliness I had just experienced. I was homeless. A 26-year-old woman with a stellar career trajectory, an Ivy League education, and nowhere to sleep. Every park bench, every hotel sign, felt like an accusation. Finally, parked under the shade of a weeping willow in a public park, I made the one call I had left. Not to an aunt or a cousin, but to my college roommate, Sharon, a graphic designer living a wonderfully normal life hundreds of miles away in Austin, Texas. The story tumbled out of me in a torrent of choked sobs. She listened without interruption. When I was done, there was no judgment, no I told you so. Just a firm, clear voice that cut through my despair. Get on the next flight to Austin, she said. I don't care what time it is or what it costs. My couch is yours for as long as you need it. My own mother had just discarded me over a real estate deal, but a friend over 1,000 miles away offered me a sanctuary without a second thought. We all have that one person, the friend who is more family than family. If you have someone like that in your life, don't wait. Just drop a heart in the comments for them, as a little public thank you for the silent heroes who catch us when we fall. That night, I booked a one-way ticket to a new life. The first few days in Austin were a blur of shame and grief. Sharon was a saint, but I spent most of my time on her couch, surrounded by the humiliating black garbage bags that held the remnants of my life. The simple act of unpacking felt like a post-mortem, sifting through the evidence of a life that was no longer mine. Most of it was just stuff, carelessly thrown together. But at the bottom of one bag, I found a small, worn, mahogany box, my father's old keepsake box. My mother, in her haste to purge me, must have mistaken it for junk. I almost set it aside. The pain of seeing his things was too fresh. But something made me open it. Beneath his old military dog tags and a faded picture of him and me at the beach was a thick, sealed envelope. In his familiar, elegant script, it just said, "For Joan." My hands trembled as I opened it. The letter was dated a year before he died. My dearest Joan, it began. If you are reading this, it means I was right to worry. Your mother is a product of her world, a world that values appearances over authenticity. But you, my firefly, you were always meant for more. Your vision and your drive are things she will never comprehend. I have set something aside for you, a seed for your own garden. It is separate from the family trust. It is yours alone. The letter gave instructions for a safety deposit box at a national bank. The next morning, I walked into a branch in downtown Austin. Inside the box was a single portfolio containing the documents for a private trust fund. The total value, $500,000. It wasn't just money. It was a posthumous vote of confidence. A weapon. My father had seen this betrayal coming, and from beyond the grave, he had just armed his daughter for war. That $500,000 felt heavier than any money I had ever known. It was a responsibility, a legacy. I could have used it to rent a beautiful apartment in downtown Austin, buy a new car, and live comfortably while I found a new job. That would have been the sensible thing to do. It's what my mother would have expected. But as I sat there, looking at my father's confident signature on those trust documents, I realized something. The ultimate revenge wasn't living a comfortable life. It was building an empire my family could never have imagined for me. The scared, approval-seeking girl who left Charleston was gone, burned away in the fire of their betrayal. It was time for the phoenix to rise. The very next week, I rented a tiny 10 by 10-foot office space in a developing part of East Austin, surrounded by startups and food trucks. I spent every cent of my father's gift with surgical precision. I hired 2 brilliant, hungry young coders and a data analyst. I worked 18-hour days, fueled by cheap coffee and a burning desire to prove my father right. We named the company Phoenix Strategies, a name that was a promise to myself. We weren't just going to build a business, we were going to rise from the ashes of the life they had torched. There is nothing more terrifying than starting from zero. No safety net, just a laptop and a belief in yourself that you have to fight for every single morning. If you have ever had to completely reinvent your life after a divorce, a job loss, a betrayal, I want you to type the word rebirth in the comments. It's a declaration that you didn't just survive the fire, you came out of it stronger. My mission was simple: become so successful that my name would be unavoidable, even in the insulated, old money world of Charleston. The first year was a brutal grind. But my father was right about my vision. I saw trends in the digital space that the old guard firms were too slow to recognize. While they were still focused on outdated metrics, Phoenix Strategies was pioneering new methods of engagement, using data to build authentic connections between brands and consumers. We weren't just another marketing agency. We were creating a new playbook. In 18 months, we went from a 3-person team in that tiny office to a staff of 60 in a sleek headquarters overlooking Lady Bird Lake. We started by landing ambitious local startups, then regional tech companies, and then the unthinkable happened. We poached a major international cosmetics brand right from under the nose of a monolithic New York agency, the kind of firm my sister Gloria idolized and name-dropped at dinner parties. The validation was intoxicating. But the sweetest moment of revenge came on a Tuesday morning, 2 years to the month after I'd been kicked out. Sharon sent me a link with no comment. It was an article in Forbes, with my picture on the cover. The headline read, "The Phoenix of the Silicon Prairie, How Joan Harrison Turned Family Betrayal into a $30 million Empire." $30 million. I had not only surpassed the value of the home they'd sold, I had built something that was entirely, unequivocally mine. I was no longer the Harrison family's dirty little secret. I was the headline. The success was everything I had dreamed of, a glaring, undeniable testament to my worth. And yet, sitting in my glass-walled office, I felt a strange emptiness. The victory was loud, but my heart was still quiet. The Forbes article was taped to the refrigerators of my employees and celebrated by my investors, but to me, it felt like a beautiful frame around an empty picture. I had built an empire of success, but I was still living in the emotional ruins of my past. I was a CEO who could command a room of 100 people, but I was still having nightmares about being left on a curb. I realized then that my revenge was incomplete. I had avenged my ambition, but I hadn't yet healed my heart. The greatest act of rebellion wasn't building a company. It was deciding that I was worthy of peace. Walking into a therapist's office for the first time was harder than any boardroom pitch I had ever made. There, I was given the words for what I had endured: complex family trauma, narcissistic abuse, scapegoating. It wasn't just my family being difficult. It was a textbook pattern of emotional manipulation. That knowledge was liberating. It allowed me to start the real work. I learned to set ironclad boundaries. I began to build a new family, a chosen family made up of Sharon, my loyal team, and eventually, a kind man named Mark who loved me for my mind, not my last name. These were people who celebrated my victories without envy and supported my vulnerabilities without judgment. This is one of the most important parts of these family revenge stories, because the first person you truly have to save is yourself. The truth is, some battles can't be won alone. If you believe that seeking help is a sign of incredible strength, not weakness, I want you to simply type the word strength in the comments. Let's flood this space with support for everyone on their own healing journey. I was finally becoming whole, forging an identity that wasn't defined by my family's rejection, but by my own resilience. 3 years after I landed in Austin, an email landed in my inbox. It was the annual fundraising gala for the Charleston Preservation Society, the absolute pinnacle of the Southern social calendar. And the chairwoman for this year's event was none other than my mother, Helen Harrison. I was about to delete it when a follow-up email from a business acquaintance in Charleston arrived. "Thought you should see this," he wrote. "The word on the street is the Harrison family is in trouble. That big development deal they sold the house for went belly up. They're nearly broke. This gala is Helen's last stand to maintain the illusion." And just like that, I knew I had to go, not for them, for me. This was the final act. I flew into Charleston on a private jet. I walked into that grand ballroom, the same room where I'd once been a gawky teenager in an ill-fitting dress, now wearing a custom black gown that screamed power. The music seemed to slow down. A wave of whispers followed me as I moved through the crowd. I saw my mother on the stage, her face a mask of strained elegance. I saw Richard and Gloria in the crowd, their eyes wide with a mixture of shock and horror. Later in the evening, my mother stood at the podium, desperately trying to coax five-figure donations from a lukewarm audience. When she paused for a breath, I made my move. I walked to the stage, took a spare microphone, and smiled at the stunned crowd. "Good evening, Charleston," my voice rang out, clear and steady. My late father, Arthur Harrison, taught me that our greatest legacy is not in the buildings we preserve, but in the future we build from the ground up. In his honor, and in honor of new beginnings, my company, Phoenix Strategies, would like to pledge a donation of $2 million. A collective gasp filled the room. My mother's face went white. In one move, I had saved her charity, exposed her desperation, and seized her social crown right off her head, all without raising my voice. I didn't stay for the aftermath. I gave a polite nod to the stunned event organizers, ignored the frantic looks from my family, and walked out of that ballroom, leaving the whispers and the chaos behind me. My work was done. The news, of course, traveled through Charleston's high society like wildfire. The story was just too delicious for them to resist. Helen Harrison, the untouchable matriarch, had been publicly saved from humiliation by the daughter she had so cruelly cast aside. My generous donation hadn't just been an act of charity. It was a spotlight, and it illuminated the deep cracks in my family's perfect facade. The illusion of their wealth and power was shattered. The invitations to exclusive yacht club events and holiday parties dried up. My mother, a woman whose entire identity was woven from social prestige, had her world yanked out from under her. She was a queen without a kingdom. The fallout was catastrophic for my siblings, too. They quickly learned that their success was not entirely their own, but had been propped up by the power of the Harrison name, a name whose definition I had just rewritten. Richard's practice saw a quiet exodus of his wealthiest patients, the ones who cared more about social standing than surgical skills. Gloria's partners at her law firm started seeing her family's public scandal as a professional liability. Their carefully curated lives, built on a foundation of judgment and exclusion, crumbled. It's funny how that works, isn't it? Do you believe in karma, that the universe eventually balances the scales? Just type a simple yes or no in the comments. I'm fascinated to see how many of us feel that justice, in some form, always finds a way. Within weeks, the empire my mother had sacrificed her own daughter to protect was in ruins. It took another month for the calls to start. They came not with apologies, but with the quiet desperation of defeated people. First David, then Gloria, and finally, my mother. Her voice on the phone was a ghost of its former self, stripped of its authority and pride. They needed help. Their creditors were closing in, and the last of their assets were on the verge of being seized. I agreed to a meeting, but not on their turf. I flew them to Austin, putting them up in a modest business hotel. The next morning, they walked into the boardroom at the headquarters of Phoenix Strategies. The four of them, Helen, Richard, Gloria, and David, sat small and humbled at my massive glass conference table, framed by a panoramic view of the city I now called home. The power dynamic had been irrevocably inverted. They laid out their situation, a litany of bad investments and social ruin. They were asking for a bailout. I listened patiently until they were finished. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't remind them of the garbage bags. I spoke to them not as a wounded daughter, but as the CEO they were now asking for a lifeline. "I will not let you go under," I said, my voice calm and measured. "Not because I have forgiven you, but because the Harrison name is now my brand, and I will protect its value." I slid a portfolio across the table. It was my offer. I would provide each of them with a structured monthly allowance enough to be comfortable, not extravagant. I would assume control of the remainder of the family trust to manage it responsibly. And my help was contingent on one non-negotiable condition. They would all attend mandatory family therapy, individually and as a group, paid for by me. They had no choice but to accept. The scapegoat had just become the new matriarch. After that meeting, I didn't feel a surge of triumph or a desire to gloat. I just felt quiet. The war was over. I had won. But the real prize wasn't controlling the family finances or holding their futures in my hands. The real prize was the freedom to finally let them go. The therapy sessions, from what I heard, were fraught and difficult. There was no miraculous Hollywood reconciliation. My relationship with them evolved into something quiet, distant, and managed through the structured environment of a therapist's office. It would never be warm, but it was, for the first time, honest. And that was enough. My true legacy wasn't in Charleston. It was here, in Austin. It was in the thriving, supportive culture I'd built at my company. It was in my chosen family, who had celebrated my housewarming in my new home a few months prior. I hadn't bought a sprawling mansion meant to impress others. I bought a modern penthouse overlooking the Austin skyline, with clean lines, open spaces, and walls of glass. It was a space that looked forward, not backward. It was a home secured not by inheritance, but by my own hard work. The day I stood in that empty living room, with the keys in my hand and the city lights twinkling below, was the first time in my life I truly felt at home. No one could pack up my life here. No one could tell me I was a burden. The nightmares of the garbage bags finally stopped. My peace wasn't rooted in their apology or acceptance. It was rooted in the unshakable knowledge that I had built a life so strong, their opinions no longer had the power to break it. So, what is the moral of my story? For a long time, I thought it was about revenge. I thought the goal was to make them feel as small and powerless as they made me feel that day on the curb. But as I stand here today, in a life I built myself, I realize the revenge was never the point. The rebuilding was. The universe did deliver a form of justice, a perfect, karmic balancing of the scales that saw their world shrink as mine expanded. But true justice, I've learned, is a quieter thing. It's the peace that comes from knowing you survived. It's the strength you discover when you are forced to be your own hero. And what about forgiveness? That's the most complicated part. I don't know if I'll ever truly forgive them for the cruelty of that day, and perhaps I don't have to. Forgiveness, for me, wasn't about absolving them. It was about absolving myself from the need for their approval. It was about accepting that the family I had was never going to be the family I needed and making peace with that grief. It's understanding that you can love people from a distance, wishing them well while fiercely protecting the sanctuary you have built. What began with garbage bags at a gate ended with the keys to my own front door, both literally and metaphorically. The journey between those 2 points taught me that family is not just the one you are born into, but the one you build with intention, trust, and unconditional love. My story is just one of many family revenge stories, but in the end, the revenge wasn't about destroying them, it was about building me. The most powerful endings often come from the most painful beginnings. If you believe in the power of rewriting your own story, of rising from the ashes stronger than before, I want you to subscribe and become a part of this community. This is a space for every phoenix out there, and our stories deserve to be heard. Thank you for listening.